Hey, this is John from Whatifi, and in this video I'm going to show you how to use our single project VFX scenario template. You'll be selecting New Scenario, Use Template, and then select our single project capacity scenario. When the scenario loads up, you will notice that we have a bunch of red events that are here. Right? Those events are designed to be blank, and then you can fill in these blanks with your information as needed. We're going to have an employee event here. You notice that this one is bypassed and it's optional. And if you know your existing employee count, you can fill this in. This is going to be harder in larger organizations where you may not have access to that. We're going to be adding in a project. For each of those projects, we're going to add a revenue. That revenue is going to help define the start date and the end date for the project. You could also use a contract event. Right now we're using an income event to be able to define that. We're going to add resources here for a couple of different job types and roles. If your project is active, you can also bring in utilization to date that'll help inform some of our capacity calculations. And then we've set you up for two decisions here. One in which whether the value of the project or the start dates and end dates of the project are subject to change. One where they keep the original source. And then lastly, I just have an expense event here that can be used as any type of event for some downstream calculations. We're going to start building out this model, and at a certain stage we're going to come up to this section here, and this is where we can add new ledgers. Some other videos here about ledgers, but ledgers are like accounts or buckets that we use to keep track of key data. And here we're going to add revenue and resource ledgers for keeping track of specific types of information that we want to be able to access more granularly in the model. So let's start by defining our first project. Now, a reminder, you can hover over top of any of these to see some of our existing notes here. Also, if you open these up, you also have access to these in this top section here, and you can see those same sort of details. So first we want to define a project. Let's just call this project 1. And by default right now, we're going to set this to be active. We're going to come back to this later and make some changes, but active means that this project is 100% awarded and all of our downstream calculations are operating at 100%. We click Update, and you'll notice anytime we make a change to an event, in the bottom left corner here, there's a Recalculate Scenario button. You need to click this to run the simulation, right? And that actually enacts anything that was changed. There's not much to see right now at this particular stage because we haven't created any calculations yet. This is more of a structural change that we've made. Okay? Now let's add our first revenue using an income event. So for example, let's call this Bid Pack 1. Okay. Here what we're doing is we're defining the amount, a cadence, and some start dates and end dates for a particular chunk of work. You could add multiple bid packs. You could add multiple sequences here. It's all a way of sort of defining this. So this bid pack 1 is associated with project 1. And here we're going to use amortized income. This is a event that can be used in many different ways. It can be used if you have income streams to have one-time income or cadenced income. But here we're going to select amortized. We are going to say that we're looking at monthly, and we're going to assume this project is $500,000. That's our current bid for it. We're going to pick a start date, and let's just say for now that that start date is February the 1st. And we're going to let this run for a couple of months. I can go and I can put in a end date here specifically. I could also use our amortization that will create that. Let's assume this is a 5-month project. You could also use a contract event to do the same thing here. And if you load up the contract event, you will see that the contract event gives you more granularity for specific milestones, specific payment amounts. So if in your model the cash flow is really important, you may want to use a contract event instead. And at the bottom here, we have the ability to decide where we're going to store this information, the calculations. So where Whatifi differs from a spreadsheet is we're also more of an accounting package under the hood. So if I select this ledger, it puts me into the income bucket, and I can drill down and I can look at some pre-created accounts here. There's main income and other income. And I'm going to go into my main income here and I'm going to create a ledger, and I'm going to call this our project 1 revenue. Okay. I'm going to leave all the settings here the same because by default it's set for financial currencies, but this is the format. I'm going to say create ledger. Now I've created that bucket and I'm going to be assigning any revenue to that, and any cash that comes in is going into a cash account, and I'm selecting update. Same thing, I need to recalculate the scenario. Now you see there's some information showing up in our threads over here, and if I open up our ledger system and select cash in the graph, you'll see that there is actually cash flow running in. It's at $500,000 amortized over the duration of that scenario. Keep in mind this is amortizing based on the number of days, so that's why you see slightly different values here because we're looking at the number of days in each month. Okay. You can also see this information in our grid view. And in the grid view, I can also open up income and open this up and find our project one revenue bucket. There's our 91,000. It rolls up to our main income, rolls up to our total income. When and if we have more than one project revenue stream in here, you will see that they aggregate up like that. So we've defined our project revenue, and then we're going into our resource needs. Now this is where we're going to stop for a second, because when we go into our resource needs, we actually need to decide which types of employees or resources we want to assign those needs to, and we haven't defined those yet. I'm going to show you in a spreadsheet where we're headed. So for example, say for our fictional project here, we could have different roles. We could have animating, lighting, and compositing, and these are the number of days that we bid. Currently in Whatifi, we function in hours as opposed to days. We're going to be making that update relatively soon. So for now, we have 640 hours of animation, 1,280 days of lighting, and 2,000 days of compositing. And we'll be supplying you a template that looks something like this. I've got some dates in here as well. I can use the dates that I've already input just for presentation purposes, but you could also have the dates for these particular roles. Okay. So going back to Whatifi, we need to define those buckets in advance. We can do that inside of the event, or we can come up here and do that on bulk. I'm going to select on this one, and here's that same new ledger manager, but this one allows us to add multiple ledgers all at the same time. When I select on this top section here, you see a much longer list. If you remember, we saw income before. These are all the predefined ledgers. Think of them as accounts or buckets that already exist, and then inside of these we can add more. Some of these, we have limited things that you can do with them because they're created by the system, and some of them you have a lot of flexibility in. We're going to use resources. Resources can be employees, this can be compute power, this can be anything that gets consumed, it can be inventory. So we're going to create something under resources, and first we're going to create sort of a larger bucket. We're going to create one called artists. Right? You can relabel these categories. We're going to call this artists, and you really can't have decimal artists here. We're going to change this way that it lays out, and at the bottom you can see how this is going to be displayed on all of our charts and graphs. We're going to create this ledger, and then I'm going to go into that ledger that we just created, and now a layer deeper down, and I'm going to start creating our subledgers. So here I want to add animators, and I'm going to give this a label, animators. There's our label. I'm going to create another one here called lighters. And I'm going to create one more called compositors. I'm going to close this down. Now those are now available to us in all of our events. So now when I go back into our resources needed, we're going to start by defining the animators that we need for this project. So we select, give it a name. I pick the project, and now I can pick the resources that are needed. There's my project number one, and inside of that I have my artist bucket, and inside of that I have those three ledgers that we created, and I'm going to select animators. Anytime we add a new project, that ledger structure gets copied underneath it like a template, and that's available to us. And if we add more ledgers, those come along for the ride. Now, I want to be able to inherit a start date and an end date for this particular chunk of work, and I'm going to be taking what we put into bid pack number one, which is a reminder we did that in the income event. So we can see those two dates that we created. And if we look back at our spreadsheet here, we had 640 hours of animation. So I'm going to put 640 hours in here, all right? And I'm going to, that's now created. I could click Update, and that's now into our calculations. And if I load up our calculations and take a look here, I'm going to see one, under my resources needed, I now have those 640 hours spread out over time. I could also see that on a graph here if I needed to. I can open this up, look at my resource needed, look at my project number one, my artists, and there are our animators. And I can also bring this up on the graph, and I can see this here at the same time too. So there's our distribution. Okay. Now, the reality is we know that we're not going to use our animation resources like this. Really, this is a department that is front-loaded, and those resources are going to wind down near the end of the project. So let's go back in. I'm going to double-click. Let's go back into this particular event. Now let's take those 640 hours and let's distribute them instead. If we select Edit Distribution, we get this modal here. And by default, we have a linear line, but we can drag these points around to better define how we think these resources are going to be used over the duration of the project. We're going to be more or less out of animation in the later stages of that project, and we're going to save that curve. So now if I update this and I rerun the calculations, we're going to see that those resources are now distributed a little bit more realistically. And this is the kind of information that we want to be able to supply to production management and other people about who we need and when we need them to successfully deliver this project. Now we got a couple other roles we still need to define. So let's go back to our spreadsheet. We have 1,280 hours of lighting. I'm going to go back into this resource event, and to make things easier, I'm going to come down here and I'm just going to duplicate this particular event. We call these records or entities once we are inside of an event. I'm going to look at my lighters. I'm going to select my lighters here, and I'm going to put in my 1,280 hours, and I'm going to change its distribution as well. Typically, lighting might be something that instead has a profile curve more like this, and we're still going to have some lighting resources available near the end of the project, and maybe they're not going to start until a little later like this, and I'm going to apply that curve. To be really clear, that curve gets multiplied against those resources that we have. So when I update this now, I go back into my Access Other Ledgers. I can go into my resources needed again. I can drill down, and I can drill down, and we need to recalculate. I can drill down into my needed, and now I also have my lighters. So I can select that and bring it up on the graph, and now we see we have our lighters here. You can use on a Mac, for example, the Command key to select more than one of these at a time. So if you want to be able to see your resource profile on the graph, you'll be able to see it like this. And as a reminder, these roll up. So you also could go into your needed for this particular project, and you could select one layer higher up, and this is going to be the aggregate of these numbers. So this is now your total resources. And again, I can Command select this, and I can Command select this, and I can have all of these on the graph at the same time. Okay. So next, we have one more resource to add. This resource is our 2,000 hours of compositing. I'm going to click into here. I'm going to duplicate this, and now I'm going to add my compositing. I'm going to select my compositors bucket, and 2,000 hours. I'm going to change this to 2,000 hours. And I'm going to change this distribution as well to be much more backloaded in the project. But let's also assume that there's a temp delivery. I'm going to leave that temp delivery in here, and then we know that most of our resources are going to function probably more like this for this particular project. And I'm going to save this curve and update this and then recalculate again. And now I'm going to have all four of these on here. The individual resources plus the aggregate of these. So now I can also look at my compositors, for example, and I can see that distribution of work. Okay. going to come back to utilization last. Let's kind of take a look at capacity now. So capacity is, what do you have, what do you need, what have you used? If I take our capacity event, right, I can calculate for each of those role types. So let's turn on animation here, and I want to be able to select for animation what my capacity. By default right now, it's 100% of the need. And I'm going to just set this a little further back in time to make sure I'm capturing the entire model. We are going to be making some changes to this in the near future, so just putting this in for now. I'm calculating my animation capacity. I am calculating my lighting capacity. And I'm duplicating this, and I'm calculating my compositing capacity. And I'm going to update this. Now, right now, this is going to be exactly the same because this is just basically telling me what I need for resources right now. If I look at my capacity, I'm going to see that it is basically the inverse. This is telling me how many artists. So now we're calculating and transforming those hours into days. So this is how many people I need for this entire project to be able to pull this off on time, assuming an 8-hour day and assuming 100% of our staffing needs on a 5-day week. So capacity can get interesting because we know that when we're trying to get a project done, sometimes we are making some subjective decisions whether we're going to work overtime or extra days per week to get through a challenge, and that's where the capacity event becomes really, really powerful. It's about how to triage those moments when your capacity is under pressure and deciding whether you truly need to hire or whether you can solve that capacity shortfall with other tools and mechanisms. So right now, again, we are under capacity. Just like those other events, capacity also now has this substructure here. So I could look at my capacity for animators, lighters, and compositors, and I could bring all of those onto the chart here at the same time too. And I can see how many animators I need, how many lighters I need, and how many compositors I need. Reminder, this is all available to you as well. And now as you see, other ledgers are showing up here as we add new events to our model. Same sort of thing, capacity artists, animators and lighters and compositors. This is what we're going to need, and this is what our shortfall is currently. Okay. Now, hypothetically, let's pretend we're into our project right now and we've actually used up some resources. This is ideally getting pulled from industry tools like ShotGrid or F-Track or whatever system you're using to track actuals to date. So let's say that we have actually used up some animation. Okay, so we're going to pick a resource. This is our animators, and we can say that we've already used 300 hours. And just for the purposes of demonstrating, I'm going to actually put this a little further into the project because I know we set some dates that are in the future. So I'm going to pretend that it is March 28th, and we used up 300 hours. Right? I can duplicate this, and let's look at lighting now, for example. And I can say that for our lighting, maybe we've used up 50 hours, and I'm going to duplicate this again, and I'm going to put in compositing. I'm going to set our compositing resources, and maybe we've gotten next to nothing at this particular stage. Maybe there haven't been a lot of resources available to us. This is going to be important if you are trying to balance your progress on a project, what you planned to do, and what's actually happening. Okay, so let's update this, resimulate the scenario. Okay, and now you're seeing there's a couple of other new things that are showing up in here. There's also resources adjusted, resources utilized, and resources needed. Okay, this is a little bit easier to see on a graph. So I'm going to go in here, I'm going to clear some of these selections out. And now I'm going to pick some high-level stuff. I'm going to select my resources needed, my resources utilized, my resources adjusted, and my capacity calculation. Okay, and we're just going to look at a top level. So as a reminder, resources needed is what I said I needed to get this project done. Okay. Resources utilized, though, is what we've used up so far. Right? So if I put both of these on the graph, we can see that this is what we said we were going to need. This is what we actually got. So we've been understaffing this project so far, unfortunately, for whatever reason. Maybe there is another project that's ahead of us or something else is sort of changing. Okay. So the resources adjusted is basically the difference between this. What were we able to get and what do we actually need now? So if I command select and add this to the graph, you'll see that given where we are in this schedule, we're actually going to require even more people now to get this project done on time. So this is redistributing the difference into the future. Okay? And that obviously is impacting our capacity, because capacity is now we're saying we're needing even more people to get this project done. Okay? Covered a lot of territory here, so this one may be a little bit confusing, but I'm going to try and explain this again. We define a project. We defined its start and its end date. We defined the resources that we were going to need and a distribution of those resources for that particular project. But we're also adding in some actuals for where we are to date. And in this particular model, our actuals are a lot less than we had hoped to have at this particular stage. We're using a capacity calculation to take all of these to then determine what is the rebalance need that we have to get this project done on time. Okay. So now we can kind of get into some little bit of a downstream, because really nothing is changing at this particular stage. But we could do a what-if scenario. Anytime you want to have more than one particular path, you need to add a decision event, right? So here's our decision event, and that allows us to kind of create option A or option B. Think of this like a choose your own adventure book where you're choosing to go left or to go right. But we want to run a potential scenario here too. So I'm going to run one where I'm going to, maybe we're in the planning stages of a project, so I'm mixing a couple of ideas here together. But if you recall, we said our project was going to start on February of 2025, right? What if it gets pushed out by 3 months? Okay. Normally what you'd have to do is you'd have to go back and maybe make a duplicate of this, change this. One's got the one start date, one's got the other start date, and then all these things are inheriting it. That's how you probably approach this in a spreadsheet. In our world, we can do these afterthoughts, these what ifs that are downstream that impact upstream events as you're planning out your scenarios. A modifier allows you to, let's call this a 3-month push. Okay? It allows us to pick something upstream. So specifically, I'm picking our income, because income is where we defined our dates. And I'm picking project revenue, and I'm selecting bid pack number 1. And I'm saying here that the start date that was February, I'm going to pick a modifier. I can change the date, or I can also add an offset, which I like to use. And I'm going to say, what if it gets pushed by 3 months? And I'm going to select update. What that is doing is just in this one scenario thread, this one version of the future, everything is delayed by 3 months. In the other version, everything is staying exactly the same. So if I run a resimulation here, you see the dollar values are still exactly the same. Let's look at our resources needed lens. If I now check select both of these, you see we have 2 different sliding and shifts of our project. There's the original sort of start date and the new start date. You're seeing slight differences here because we're mixing things together where we have resources needed and some of our utilization in here. But conceptually, that's what this is doing. In one version of the future, the project is pushed. In another version of the future, it's staying exactly the same. So now we've defined and showed how a modifier can be used. It's a very powerful event that allows you to change things in single versions of the future without having to override manually real values. Right? Now I'm going to show you one thing that we can kind of do with our project event, though, in the planning phase. So currently right now, this project is set to 100% active. Right? If you are in a planning phase in production management sometimes wants to look at the weighted value. If I turn on custom states, right, and relatively soon this will be tied into HubSpot and Salesforce, you'll be able to pull these in manually. You can kind of go into this and you can say that this is a sort of a potential project, right? And you could say that the probability of this being awarded right now, we're pretty far along in our stage, it's a 0.8. And if I select update here, it's going to be hard to kind of show this in action, so maybe it's best just if we look at our resources needed cumulatively. We see that we have 3,920 hours currently required for the project. If we use this weighted value, that 0.8 gets applied against both your revenue and your resources, and you'll see that we now have a smaller amount required to be able to pull off that project. So it ripples that percentage through anything inside of here to kind of give you the weighted version. So now you can see how powerful a modifier can be. But now I'm going to run a couple of scenarios here to experiment with what happens if we change some upstream calculations for resources and the viability of these particular projects. We give you the ability in the project event to also set a custom state. Right now we're assuming this project is awarded, but what if this project wasn't awarded? What if it was a potential project, for example, and right now there's an 80% probability of that project landing? I pre-entered these in here just to be kind of clear. Normally you'd have to add these in. What this does, if you notice right now we have 3,920 hours of total resources that are required. If I update this and calculate, you'll see now that we've reduced this by 20%, right? Everything, the dollar value and the resources are now taking that weighting into account and multiplying it downstream. This can be used by production management sometimes to make sure that we're not overstaffing or understaffing. We're using the probability of an award to drive that calculation. Now keep in mind, modifiers can be stacked. So I can also come back to this one, and I'm just going to kind of go off script here. I'm going to create another scenario here that says, what if this project is actually 100% awarded? Okay, I'm going to come into our modifier, and I'm going to add in a second modifier. I'm going to pick the modifier here. I'm going to add it to the canvas. And this time I want to say the full award. Okay, so what I'm looking at is I'm looking for my projects. I'm targeting the project event. I'm targeting project 1 in particular, and I'm taking its probability adjustment, and I'm going to change that value, and I'm going to assume that's awarded. I'm going to set that to be a 1, and I'm going to submit. So now I've added in this particular scenario an override that's making this 100% awarded. In this particular scenario, it's still only 75% awarded. Right? Best practices is to relabel these as we go. So I'm going to call this 100% award. I'm going to update this, and I'm going to recalculate. And now we're starting to see some changes in our threads. You notice this thread has a different dollar value. One is the reduced award, one is the full award. And if I can select both of these at the same time, you'll now see that I actually have different resources needs over time. In one scenario, the resources start right off the bat, but it's the partial award amount. In the other scenario, it is delayed, but is the full award amount. And that's why we can now start to see some very different calculations here as we look at what those two options could be. Okay, what have we done here? We've stacked a couple of modifiers. One is the delay. And I'm going to clean this up. And we have the 100% award. We're going to resimulate these, and we have two different scenario threads that are playing out over time. Okay. Now keep in mind, at any particular stage, you can also bypass an event. So remember, we put this utilization in as a bit of a placeholder. It doesn't really make sense in this model, to be honest with you, because we're planning for a future project. And the time of recording here, I'm recording this on December the 8th. So I could also come in here and I can bypass this event and recalculate this and temporarily take this out of the model for now. This is just a little bit more accurate to my sort of situation here right now. Okay. So now I'm just going to cover how you could actually add some employees into your model if you needed to. You notice in our capacity calculations, everything was negative here because it's implying that we don't actually have the resources available to us to be able to do these projects. If you have access to employee accounts, you can come into your employee event here, and I could put in, for example, animators. I'm going to define how many animators that I have. You can define specific people or placeholders, which are larger groups. So for example, here right now, I'm taking our resources and our artists and our animators, and I could have a specific person. So maybe this is, let's say this is Bill, who happens to be an animator. Bill is working 40 hours a week. Bill has a start date of January the 1st, and maybe he's on a contract, so he only runs until March 28th. You could also put in financial data if you needed to here. But if I select Update Now and recalculate, you're going to see there's now actually another ledger that shows up in here. There should be a ledger just called Resources. Now, reminder, I need to unbypass this calculation because I had it bypassed. And if I select Recalculate, Now if I come into some of our ledgers here, you're going to see there's a new ledger inside of this one called Resources. And if I open this one up, this is kind of the what do you have bucket. And here's my one artist. And if I drill a little deeper down, I can see that I've got one animator in these sort of given months and times here. It's also available to us on our graph as well, just like everything else is. So you can also see your resources that you actually have, right? So if I'm doing a top level thing, I'm looking at my resources, and I'm looking at my resources needed, and there's a big difference between those two. All right? Let's go a little bit further this one. Maybe I'm going to duplicate this, and this is now going to be just a bucket of animators. I can select placeholders, and now you see that there's a number of employees that I have. I'm going to clear my end date, and I'm actually going to go back in time here and just say that maybe I have some staff animators, and I have 2 staff animators, okay? So I'm going to put this onto the graph. I'm going to recalculate this. And now if I look at my resources, you'll see that there are actually more resources available to me here, right? There is my bill, our contractor, and our regular resources. So now I'm going to go back in and drill a little bit deeper down. If I look at my capacity, and I look specifically at my animation capacity, I'm now doing a next generation calculation where I'm taking what do I have minus what do I need. So in this particular model now, I actually have some overstaffing going on. I have my 3 animators, but then I'm using some of those resources on this particular project, and then I'm coming back up to my default values. Right? So again, here I'm overstaffed to a degree in our model. Okay, let's kind of go and do that now, say for lighters, for example. And to make this a little bit more intuitive, I'm going to go into my resources needed, and for illustration projects, I'm going to look at my lighters and my compositors. I'm going to look at my lighters. So there's a point here where I need a lot of lighters, 364 hours worth of lighting. So if I kind of come into my lighting here right now, I'm going to create one more bucket. I'm going to call this lighters. I'm going to select the lighters ledger, and I'm going to put a placeholder in here, and I'm going to say that I've got working 40 hours a week. I have 3 lighters, and these are just my staff lighters. I'm going to put them on the graph here and say update. Okay. So now when I run my calculations, if I look at my capacity for lighters, keep in mind you can search for these up here as well. Look at my capacity for lighters. We're going to see that we actually have a different sort of challenge here too. We have our 3 lighters, and we are now getting down really, really low and close to actually being out of lighters. Let's change this value here. Let's change this to be 1, for example. And now we're going to get a slightly different graph. We can see when we have plenty of capacity and when we're actually going to be under capacity in lighting in our particular model here at the same time too. Okay. Covered a lot of territory in this. So at any stage, you're welcome to reach out, and we are happy to help you work through this model together. We've defined employees. What do we got? We've created a project. We've created the start date and the end date and the dollar value for that project. We've given that project a weighting, a percentage award here of 80%. We've defined the resources that we need from our bid to be able to complete this work on the schedules that we have. We're inheriting the dates from this income event here. We are adding utilization if we want to, if we're in the middle of a project, to see what have we used up so far and how well we are pacing. And then we're running capacity calculations. And a reminder, you could come into this one if you wanted to. You could change how that calculation is going. So we're weighting to a different percentage. So maybe now we're trying to staff to 90% of our need. So here, if you notice, we were looking at being negative 1.3. If we're staffing to 90% of our need, then those calculations are going to change slightly. This is probably a rounding error here right now, so we're not seeing something large enough. Given the nature of that, let's just sort of prove a point and say if I'm going to staff to 30% of my need, which is extreme, and update this one, we should now be seeing a different calculation. Yeah, negative 1.3. Okay, I'm going to put this back to 100%. We have 2 versions of the future, one with no modifications, one where we have a 3-month delay, and one where we're changing the weighting of that project to be 100%. And keep in mind, you could also create downstream what-ifs here as well. we wanted to, I can add in another decision here right now, and I can submit that. And if I wanted to, I could have one where we still have the 3-month delay, we have the 100% award, and I could also add another one in here, which is a null. And this null is now saying, in this version, I have the 3-month delay, I have the 100% award, and I have the default award, what we sort of set up here, and I can connect this into my expense event downstream, close that connection, and I can resimulate. And now for production, I have 3 different scenarios. One which is no modifications, one with a 3-month delay and the full award, one with a 3-month delay and the awaited award at the same time too. And all of those are available to us here on the graph at the same time. Welcome your feedback and your thoughts. And as a reminder, we are going to be having for the next few months weekly office hours, and we're happy to help you build out your model together. Thanks.